Hey, how many of you remember the scene in Waiting for Superman where Jeffrey Canada explains how his mother shatters his dreams by telling him Superman isn't real? He's not real? What are you talking about? Who's going to save us? Because as a little boy growing up in Harlem, he couldn't imagine anything less could make his life better. Well, I can kind of sympathize with Canada. When I was growing up, I loved watching Super Friends every Saturday morning with my brother and sister, and we too were thinking about a more heroic existence. But when I figured out that that little tin tiara wasn't going to save anybody, thankfully there were a few real-life superheroes who showed up in my life. Because like 90% of the kids in DISD out there today, growing up, my family was very poor, but we were very proud. My first superhero, my mom. She was a single mom who worked multiple jobs always. She paid our bills paycheck to paycheck, or at least as often as she could. And thankfully, I was from a very large Mexican Catholic family, and I had 6 other aunts who had that same very hardworking, determined, no excuses attitude that Mom was raising all of us with. Now, unfortunately, in my small town, everyone else wasn't quite as unified. I mean, we literally lived on the other side of the fence in a 4-room house with a chain link fence about maybe 4 feet away from our front door. And unfortunately, my dad was a troubled Vietnam vet who was struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder and a significant amount of alcoholism. So while Mom moved us out of a house that included him, it really wasn't until we had all seen an awful lot. Thankfully, us kids weren't the only ones watching. In fact, my neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Wilkie, who lived across the street, was also an elementary teacher. She was tall and pretty, and she had these long, graceful hands, and she would write the entire alphabet in perfect cursive without even lifting off the chalk. It was amazing. Well, she convinced my mom to trust her and to enroll us in Jefferson Elementary. She would keep an eye on my little brother, and best of all, as you can see, I ended up in Mrs. Wilkie's class. But more often than not, she came up with these out-of-school, after-school projects where she really needed our help. And I know really what she was doing was making sure us kids weren't at home alone. So she had this way of looking at us so differently and saying, if school is as good as it's going to get, I'm going to make it as great as it can. And it was. I fell in love with school, and ever since then, just being in a school building seems magical to me. Well, and when I moved into high school, it wasn't much different. I was there from sunup to sundown most days, and why not? I had great teachers in Kenneth Yount and David Fleming. Mr. Yount was my math teacher most years. That man taught on the first day of school and the last day of school and every day in between. Now, I wouldn't say he was stern, but he was certainly not there to entertain us. But you respected him, and he respected you. I'd like to say that he turned calculus into poetry, but given our prior speaker, I can honestly tell you I know nothing about poetry. I could not do that. But he did make calculus a breeze, which meant that I probably could end up with a pretty decent SAT score. And with great teachers like them pushing me on campus, and my mom at home driving and driving us, and I'll tell you, I have to applaud her courage, and that's what it was. She had only a high school diploma, but she was convinced that education would be the difference. She trusted the Dorothy Wilkies of the world. So I moved on to SMU, once again as the beneficiary of many other superheroes, quite honestly, so many of which I've never even met. And just when I thought I'd hit my stride, and I had left so much of that behind, my brother, who too was looking forward to the next fall and leaving Seguin for Stephen F. Austin, was in a horrible accident that took his life at the age of 18. We were devastated, as you can imagine. And when my mom and my sister and I couldn't put 2 words together, it was that guy, David Fleming. He was our English teacher. He had taught Billy, he had taught me, and he showed up and he delivered a eulogy to a standing room only congregation. And before I left Seguin to try to come back to school, he pulled me aside and said, Abster, you will carry on. And I did, but thankfully when I got back here, it was really because I had some really great, compassionate professors on the hilltop who probably cut me some slack over winter break to make up for what I didn't get in the fall. And Mr. Fleming has hung around. A decade later, when my husband helped establish our very first scholarship program that was in my brother's honor, it was Mr. Fleming who sat at the table with us and chose our awardees. Because just like back then, Mr. Fleming knew every single kid in the class. Billy and I could not have been more different academically speaking. He was a huge athlete. He was captain of the football team, but sometimes he struggled in the classroom. I may have been a stronger student, but I can't catch a ball if you toss it to me from 3 feet away. But somehow, it was so important to him that every single student leave his classroom better prepared, and he had to know us in order to figure out how to make that happen. Billy loved Greek mythology. I, at best, learned how to write at least a decent enough essay to get me into SMU. But even once I got back to SMU, I still loved that whole math thing. Mr. Yount really solidified that. Well, I didn't know what I was going to do with that. How was I going to make a living with that? How was my life going to be different with that? Thankfully, I had great professors like Rex Thompson and Mimi Alciator, who helped understand who I was, what my talents could be, and introduced me to industries and people who were already there. I couldn't tell you what an investment bank did, and I certainly had never traveled to New York City. But that didn't matter, because they, like my teachers before, were there to help me forget. They were there to help me forget how I didn't think I measured up, help me forget what I didn't think I had. They made me forget to be afraid, and instead they made me focus, maybe just on one thing. Maybe it was just that job interview, but it could turn into a really great thing. And then when I got to Goldman Sachs, I learned a thing or two about a spreadsheet, and I also figured out that Wall Street really wasn't going to be for me long term. But by then, I would have choices, and I would be in the driver's seat of my life. But my childhood is not that uncommon, right? In fact, by many circumstances, it's probably not that bad. And I also know that there are so many dedicated parents, just like my mom, and there are kids with perseverance and grit ready, but a lot of hard work without a vision for where you're going or any faith in the path that you're pursuing sometimes can just really make you really tired. There are hundreds of thousands of kids out there waiting for their Superman. They're waiting for you. Because when you take the time to know them, while you're making sure they know their multiplication facts and proper punctuation, you're helping them learn how to dream, and it's your faith in them that teaches them to understand who they can become. Now, I'm not trying to say that my route is the only route. Heck, it certainly wasn't one without many mistakes. But I know that it has been sprinkled with more opportunity than either my mother or I could have possibly imagined on our own from the backside of that chain link fence. So I know that you know who you are. You know what I'm talking about. And I know that there are more Dr. Flemings, David Flemings, Dr. Thompsons, Mimi Alciators, and Dorothy Wilkies in this room than the Dallas Morning News possibly has room to print. And I thank you. I thank you for carrying on what I believe is an absolutely heroic mission every single day. Thanks for having me in your schools when you can, and thank you for allowing me to share my journey today.